Okay, welcome back everybody. Let's talk more about trees. Alright, let's get to the part where we're protecting forests. This is the fun part. We finally get to law. Actually, the law and the regulation is so protecting forests. Who was the last one? Mr. Surik. Mr. Mai Surik.
Protecting forests. The whole forest industry has 5 branches. Myanmar Timber Enterprise (MTE), responsible for timber harvesting, buying, ESOP or joint ventures, sources of income. Forestry Department, responsible for protection and conservation of forests and forest resources, make marks trees to be cut, and dry zone greening department, responsible for reforestation in dry zones of central Burma. Planning and statistics department works with forestry department to select annual allowable cut. Environment and nature resources and conservation DIP.
That's short for department.
Department may have been replaced by the new Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Forestry.
Okay, and then, well, let's A-Way finish.
However, new forest rules have not been written available in the government's conservation law. The government says the rules for 2030.
Okay.
What are the 1992 forest Act and 1995 forest rules supposed to do? Then later we will look to see what can go wrong.
Okay, so as we talked in the last class, Burma has a new environmental conservation law, and they said, the government has already said it will write new forestry laws for 2013. And when I checked, all the departments under this is the old forestry ministry. So I don't know how the new ministry, they have a new Ministry of Environment and Forest. I don't know how these departments fit with the new ministry. It's something we have to see. But all of these departments still have websites right now, and they still have documents. So these departments still exist. Even though you have a new forest ministry, these departments still exist. So, but it's a question, we'll have to see in the next year how the new ministry, if they'll change anything about the old. But this is definitely the 5 divisions that have been there for many, many years, and that are still continuing now. And we already talked about these before. The MTE has the monopoly on actually cutting wood, responsible for timber harvesting. Does anyone know this word harvesting?
Yes.
What does the word harvest mean? That's actually cutting, yeah. And also with agriculture, when you harvest the crops, you take it out of the ground. Harvesting is actually taking it out of the ground. So the MTE has the monopoly. They're the only ones that are allowed to cut, because all forests are state land. The MTE is the only one that has the right to cut. And you know the term monopoly.
Yeah.
What's monopoly?
It is hard to explain in English.
A monopoly means one company that owns the entire industry. So when you have one company for an entire industry, that's called a monopoly. So the MTE has the monopoly for logging in Burma on state land. But the even though it has the monopoly, it allows joint ventures. And you all know what a joint venture is? What's a joint venture? That's right, it's when two companies work together, especially when you have the government and a private company working together. That's a joint venture. So the MTE has a monopoly on all logging on state land. Not the ethnic group land, not ceasefire zones, only for state-controlled land. But it does have joint ventures with private companies, the source of the income. The forestry department, this still exists under the new ministry, but this is the one actually responsible for protecting the forests. While we will read in the next section how they actually protect them, the forestry department actually marks the trees to be cut. You know, and by this term mark, I mean they literally mark the trees. They'll put a mark on a tree and say this tree is allowed to be cut. So the forestry department marks the trees to be cut, and the MTE actually cuts them. They're supposed to work together to protect. So the forestry department says which trees you can cut to protect the amount of forest, and the MTE actually cuts them. They're supposed to work together. But sometimes that doesn't work as planned, but that's how it's supposed to work. They have this dry zone greening department. This is for the dry zone of central Burma. When we talked about climate change, do you remember I said one of the effects will be the less water and the drying? It will be particularly bad for central Burma. Central Burma is turning into something like a desert right now. And every year it's getting worse. So one way I said we can protect that is to plant new forests. That's the job of this department, dry zone greening. I don't know if we'll talk about it much in this class, but it's worth knowing that they have a department for trying to help central Burma. So when the forestry department's picking these trees to be cut, they're supposed to work with the statistics department. By the way, everybody, repeat this word after me. Statistics. Statistics. Okay, statistics. Statistics. Okay, you got it. Good. Okay. So, all right. So, statistics department. So there is a department. They work with the forestry department to actually pick which trees. They actually do the statistics. But as we said before, there's a big problem with statistics in Burma. So they have a lot of trouble doing their job. This is maybe one of the hardest departments. They have the hardest work to do. And then we have this conservation department. I don't know what the purpose of this, now that they have a new environmental ministry, I don't know what the purpose of this department is anymore. I think it's part of the new ministry. But we will see in the next year. Okay, so right now the current legislation for forests is the 1992 Forest Act. And then this was just general rules. They actually created specific rules in the 1995 Forest Rules. This is the actual logging laws that are in power in Burma right now that we're going to look at next, these 1995 Forest Rules. These may be changed in the next year, but they should be built off these same rules. Okay, so now we're going to look at what they're supposed to do. Anytime you look at law in Burma, there's always two perspectives. What the law is supposed to do and what actually happens on the ground. So we're going to look at what it's supposed to do to protect the forests. And then later we'll look at why the law can go wrong on the ground. What the problems can be. So let's start with the Myanmar selection system, the former Burma selection system. Who's next to read? That would be Ruby.
Myanmar selection system. Burma is famous in state for the past century. Approach to logging in Asia, now called the Myanmar selection system. Areas of forest are divided into 30 blocks of equal size. Logging is on a 30-year valid cycle. A block is cut for 1 year, then allowed to regrow trees for 29 years. When a block is cut, only trees above a thickness diameter are allowed to be cut within The annual allowable cut is guide on the next page. The forestry department ensures sleds and gunless trees. For west chief forest, the size 33 cubic
73
73
centimeters.
centimeters. For dry chief forest, the size 63 centimeters. For hardwood trees, it's verified by tree.
Okay, let's stop right there. Okay, first let's understand this part. So I should draw a picture of this. By the way, for this M3, you would pronounce it cubic meters. So if you, yeah, cubic meters. So if you see this M3, cubic meters, because I'm going to erase this now to show how the selection system works. So they have a group, so you have a patch of land. Here's a patch of land, and they divide it into these 30 sections. 30 sections. And what they do is, 1 year you will cut this. This will be like the first year you cut this block, and then the second year you cut this block. The third year, all the way down to 29 and 30. So what it means is, you cut this year, so 1 year you cut this block of trees, and then you leave it alone for 29 years. So 30 years later, you come back. So that means each block has 30 years to allow new trees to grow up. This is the, so do you understand? It's on 30-year blocks. We draw this the first year, and then the second year, we only cut this block. We do not cut this in it again. In the third year, we only cut this block. We don't cut these blocks. So then after 30 years, you come all the way back and then back to this block, and now you'll have new trees to cut because they will have grown. So it's called a 30-year felling cycle. To fell, you know, it's the verb to fall. So the 30-year cycle of trees falling. And then you wait 30 years. That allows the new trees to grow up bigger, and then you can cut these new trees. So this is sustainable. This means however many, it's designed so that no matter how many times you go through the cycle, there's always the right number of trees 30 years later for you to cut. You'll never lose forest over time. You will maintain the same amount of forest because you wait for a block, you'll cut it 1 year, and then you will not cut any more trees until 30 years later. So it's designed to allow the forest to stay the same size. So about 30 blocks of equal size. A block is cut for 1 year, then allowed to regrow trees for 29 years before you cut it again. Okay, so do you understand this part? 30 years. 30-year cycle. You know this term in English, cycle? It's like a bicycle. It's a cycle. It goes in a circle. So this is a 30-year cycle of cutting the land. This is actual a patch of land, an actual part of the forest. So 30 parts in a cycle of cutting it over 30 years. So do you understand, is anything confusing about the 30-year cycle through a forest? This is an entire forest. This picture is an entire forest. And then we break up the forest into 30 pieces. I think you understand, but you're all just staring at me, so.
Yes.
Okay. So when you're cutting one block, you do not cut every single tree in this block. You only cut trees that are above a fixed thickness, diameter. So do you know the term diameter? I will show you the term diameter. This is a circle. This is the diameter. Diameter. This is a circle. Do you have a word for this in Burmese?
Yes.
Achin? Okay. I pronounced it probably terribly. Diameter is the length, the thickness of the whole tree, the thickness. Obviously, this is looking, you know, this is a tree, so this is when you cut it, looking down at the circle part. The diameter is the thickness of the tree. So you do not cut every single tree inside this box. You only cut the trees that are above this diameter. And then there are different sizes. So for the wet teak forest, it would be 73 centimeters. So they have a tool that will measure, and if it's 73 centimeters or bigger, you can cut it. If it's less than that, you leave it alone and you allow it to grow. You leave it alone for 29 years and then it will grow to be over the size. So 30 years later, it will be big enough now. So you do not, it's like, you do not cut young trees. This is the basic lesson. You do not cut young trees, you cut old trees. Cut old trees. You cut old trees and you leave young trees. It's just like fish. With fish, if it's a certain small fish, you throw it back in the water. If it's big enough, you can keep it. It's just like fish. If the log is big enough, then it's an adult tree, you're ready to cut it. If it's too small, it's a young tree, you leave it and let it grow to cut later, the next cycle. All right. So it's the right thickness also within the annual allowable cut, which we'll describe on the next page. But you also do not cut every big tree either. You only cut the number of trees that are in the annual allowable cut. So an annual allowable cut is like a number of trees you can cut. Like maybe you can cut 500 trees in here for this. They'll have a cut for the entire region, and then you divide it how much for each box. So then the rule would be like you can only cut 500 trees that are bigger than this inside this box for a year. So the job of the forestry department is it actually selects and girdles the trees. So the forest department, you have an entire forest. The forest department actually selects the trees that you can cut. And then girdles is it puts a covering around the tree that will dry the tree. I need to research more myself about what girdling means, but usually they girdle a tree. It will make it much cleaner when you cut it. It will allow new trees to grow around it. Because if you just use a bulldozer, then it will destroy the land around a tree. So you cannot grow new trees around it. But if they girdle a tree, it will allow new trees to grow in that land because it doesn't hurt the land. Do you know what the term girdle actually means? It's a wrapping. You wrap it around your body. Especially, it's a kind of women's clothing too. It just wraps around, like a tight dress. It wraps around the tree. So this protects the land around the tree. And also it dries the tree so that you can float it on water. And when you float it on water, then, that's how they move trees often, is floating it on water. So you need to girdle it to make it dry. Anyway, the job of the forest department is actually pick the trees and girdle them. And then here are the size for these weak teak forests, the diameter, for the dry teak forests, and then for hard trees. Every tree will have a different diameter by how its age. So let's read about let's read about other things.
Smaller trees may not be cut and are left to grow unless they are just sick, mud fiber, and wood survives. If there are few seed-bearing trees left, some big trees are left to provide seed. If remaining trees are only 10 cm less than bigger diameters, they are cut to predict future years and mud.
Okay. So this says what I just said before. The smaller trees, if your tree is smaller than this, you do not cut it and leave it to grow. Unless it's judged to be a sick tree. If a tree is very sick and they think it will not survive 30 years, then they go ahead and cut it. Survive means to stay alive. So if there's a sick tree that you can still market, they will cut it. So if there are a few seed-bearing trees left, some big trees are left to provide the seeds. So this is what we said with the You remember the picture behind this? You had the healthy forests and unhealthy forests. So a lot of that, a healthy forest has to do with the seeds. The healthy trees drop seeds that grow new healthy trees, strong trees. So they also count how many trees leave seeds. Seed bearing. You know this term bearing? Yeah, you can use like, I'm a pin bearing person. It's when you're carrying something. So seed bearing tree means a tree that's holding the seeds. So they count how many trees are having seeds. If there's very few trees that have seeds, then they will leave the big trees to provide seeds so that healthy trees can keep growing in the new generation. Things like this are important to remember because in practice, loggers get very greedy and they want to cut the small trees. They want to cut the seed-bearing trees. They don't care about the seeds for the next generation. They care about making money now. But this is why it's a problem, because if you want to leave some big trees to provide seeds so you have healthy trees in the next generation. So these are rules. This is part of the law. By law, you're not allowed to cut trees smaller than this diameter. And by law, you need to leave seed-bearing trees. You need to count how many trees will leave seeds and leave some big trees for the seeds. And then the other part of the law, you look at the trees that are smaller than this. If they're only 10 centimeters less, so this would be trees that are like this size, like 63 centimeters. If there are trees that are only 10 centimeters less, then they count these trees and they say, we predict 30 years from now, these are the trees we will cut. So you're making a prediction every term. So you cut so many trees this year, you make a prediction how many trees you will cut in the 30 years. And then you count. You actually count the trees you want to cut for the next year, if they're 10 centimeters less. So if they're almost the right size, but just a little too less, they count those trees and they predict this is how many we should cut next year. So this is to be able to take good statistics. Oh. Oops. Okay, well anyway. So the key to this system is good statistics. Because when they pick they choose the number of trees you can pick, which is called the annual allowable cut. This is a number that scientists decide how many you can cut to leave new trees to grow for the next generation. You should not cut more than these. Picking this number depends on the statistics. Having good numbers. So you want to count how many trees you should cut the next 30 years from now to pick a good annual allowable cut. So is there anything about this part that's confusing? We have the 30-year cycle. That part is kind of easy. And then we have the size of the tree. You should cut it if it's a certain size. And then for the ones that are a little smaller, we should count how many small trees there are that we should cut the next time, the next cycle. 30 years from now, we will cut these trees. Yes?
If there's a problem, if we don't cut any tree, and that is a problem.
If you don't cut any trees?
Yes, we have a lot of healthy trees, right? A big tree. And then if we don't cut them, for the small tree, maybe they cannot grow. So,
No, more healthy trees is healthy for the forest. Yeah, because the healthy trees will drop seeds that will grow the new healthy trees. So the more healthy trees you have, the forest gets thicker. Do you remember we talked about the difference between closed forest and open forest? Mm-hmm. Closed forest is when more than 50% of it is forest, and open is when less than 50%. So when you give that example, you don't cut the tree, then what happens is over time, the forest will get more thick. More trees will grow closer together. So it's very healthy, actually. When you don't touch a forest, it just gets thicker and thicker. More and more trees grow in a smaller space, and the forest becomes more and more healthy. So it's actually good when you don't cut trees. The forests can heal themselves. Forests have a magic power to heal themselves when they're left alone. If a forest is left alone, it will heal itself. So you'll have an open forest. If you just leave it alone, more trees will grow. Maybe I can draw a picture of that too.
Okay.
I mean, it's like, you know, in 1 year you have this. This is like the year 1. And then the second year, you just have trees that'll grow in the between them. And then the third year, more trees growing in between them. So you see, I say 1 year, but maybe it's like every 5 years. You know, every 5 years, the forest is getting thicker and thicker and more healthy. So when you leave a forest alone, it can heal itself. If you don't touch it. So this is what happens. And this is why there's a 30-year cycle. That means for 29 years, you do not touch a forest. You just let it heal. You leave it alone. Though under the law says you should leave the forest. If this is 1 block, then you, for 29 years, don't cut. You don't cut it for 29 years. You just leave it alone for the new trees to grow. And for some trees to get bigger. So actually, by law, we're supposed to leave forests alone for 29 years on a 30-year cycle. Yes.
After 30 years, and then we cut.
We cut the big ones. Yeah, then we'll cut the big ones.
I think if we cut the big one, and then the small one also will destroy on the big one.
We cut the big ones, and then the small ones grow to become big ones later.
If the big one fall down on the small one.
No, they're girdled. Remember I told you they're covered. They put a girdle around them so that they will not cause damage. That's the importance of girdling. You cover you put it's like a kind of net around the tree, so that when you pull it down, it's very healthy to the land around it. It's called girdling. When you do not girdle, then it will destroy the land around, and that's bad. When you just get a bulldozer or some kind of cutting methods, they're not very healthy for the forest. But the girdling method is most healthy. And things like elephants. Elephants are very good, because the elephant will lift it right out by the root. And elephants do not destroy the land, because, you know, elephants are part of nature. So it's very good to have elephants pull the trees down. Better than the, you know, electric saw or a bulldozer. A bulldozer will destroy the land, but an elephant is much better.
Teacher, I
Yes.
think it may not be the same because we have different different plants, right? different
Kinds of trees, yeah. Every
So,
tree is a little different.
Every tree they might not grow from the seed, so we might need to buy the plant from the shop and then grow. Because if we look at it over here, we have teeth, right? So they are little big, but they doesn't grow a new one, a small one. Not even though we let them, we don't cut them.
Yeah.
There is not a new one.
Well, it takes many, many years. I mean, that's why you wait 29 years. They do not happen in 1 year. And then also, forest, this is not, one other issue, this is not like a forest here.
Yeah.
This is like, we have planted them a little artificially. So this is more like a plantation than a forest. A forest has its own ecosystem to allow new trees to grow. Because they have the animals around, you know, the birds and the bees. So you have the little animals that eat the acorns, that's the seeds, and then the little animals will plant them. So forests work by their own ecosystem. I mean, the simple answer is, this is like the scientific method. They had many scientists that worked out the most optimal method, and they said, to leave the forest alone for 29 years and let them grow new trees and let the small trees grow to be bigger trees. This is the optimal method that they decided. That everyone agrees on that part. And then leaving the seed-bearing trees. But yeah, 30-year cycle, so it's not like 5 years. 30 years is a long time. Okay, and then they count some of the smaller trees that they expect to cut the next term. Okay, let's look at the annual allowable cut, finally, which would be Olokamakor.
Anywhere allowance cut is with the statistic for how to preserve most trees. The FDC says annual allowance cut never for 30 years period. The trees cut should be inside the AAC. The AAC will be changed to a new number. For 1971 to 2000, the AAC was 695 cubic meter for trees and
2 million. 2 million.
2 million.
2,463,600 cubic meters.
For hardwood tree, for 2001, 2030, the AAC is about 300
K is 1,000.
and 2.55 million cubic meter cut.
Hardwood. Okay. Alright, so the forestry department sets an annual allowable cut for a 30-year period. So they say in that 30-year cycle, they'll say we want to cut this many trees in the entire 30 years. And then what they do is for each box, they will divide how many can we cut this year so that over the entire 30 years, we only cut the annual allowable cut. The annual allowable cut is a number of trees. Well, technically it's the cubic meters of trees, so it's not the literal number of trees, it's the number of wood you're getting from the trees. But they will translate that into an actual number of trees you can cut. The annual allowable cut is the number of trees you can cut. So in 30 years. So they set that annual allowable cut for the entire 30-year cycle. And then for each block, they will set a number for each block. How many can we cut in this block to keep the AAC, the annual allowable cut? So it's an actual number of trees they're deciding. And the forest department decides on that number. All right, and then let's read about the next one.
In the area has trees are less getting and stands up for 3 years to try that so they can if they can be carried by this truck or is the longer rust they are extracted.
Okay. Extracted means taken out. You extract minerals from mines, you extract trees from forests. So in many rural areas, they do not cut them right away. they will girdle them, cover them with this net, and leave them standing for 3 years. And this kills the tree, but the tree will dry. The tree will become very dry, and when the tree is very dry, it will float on water. And then they can carry the trees down the river. But if you're carrying the trees by truck, then usually they'll just cut the trees still green. They'll just cut the trees right away. So let's read about the MTE. Tune.
The Myanmar Timber Enterprise MTE is responsible for actually harvesting teak and hardwood. For state-controlled land, sometimes in joint ventures with private companies, the ceasefire areas, the ceasefire group will control the area, and private companies are harvesting.
Okay. We already said that before. In the state-controlled land, the MTE has the monopoly for actually cutting the teak and hardwood. But in the ceasefire areas, the ceasefire group will control it, one of them, and private companies are actually doing the cutting. Solomon, let's read about.
The MTU employed 38 agencies to assist with extraction and rafting the timber. In the past, elephants were used for extraction, which is more sustainable, but recently more heavy equipment is used.
Okay, so the MTE has these 38 different agencies. The MTE is not just one government office. It actually has these 38 different offices, groups inside of it that do assist with all the cutting and the rafting. Do you know the term rafting? Rafting is floating the wood on the water. So there will be one agency and their job is to build a road to get to the wood. So actually you need to build roads to be able to get the equipment to the forest. So one group's job will be to make roads. Another job will be to actually cut the wood. And then you will have truck driving companies, and their job is to carry the wood by trucks. And then you'll have rafting companies, and their job is to raft, put the logs into the water to move them by the river. In the past, elephants were used for extraction, which is more sustainable. Recently, more heavy equipment is used. And heavy equipment will hurt the forest and make it harder to regrow healthy. You can use the heavy equipment. Okay. So this is a picture of how the AAC is supposed to work. If you wanted to see a graphic. So the first thing, assessment of AAC. So the first thing they do is try to pick a good number of trees. They do an assessment to pick a good number of trees. The second step, the forest department, FD means forestry department. The forestry department will actually select. They will actually go into these lots, into this forest, and it will actually select the trees to cut. The forestry department does that. And then it will girdle, and so for the teak it will actually girdle. It will cover the trees that can be cut. And then enumeration means it will count. Enumeration means to count. It will count the trees that are still left. So it will pick some of these trees and girdle them, and then it will count the number of trees that are too small. And then for hardwood, the same thing. They will mark the hardwood trees and also count the trees left. This is the forestry department's job. Then you have the loggers coming in later, run by the MTE, and they will actually cut the trees, logging. And then you have the forestry department again, coming for a post-harvest inspection and reporting. After the MTE cuts, the forestry department will return to make sure, they'll do an inspection to make sure that the right number of trees were cut. And then after all this, they have an assessment of the AAC. Then they pick the next number to make sure that we're still on track to meet the annual allowable cut. And then the forestry department will do that with the statistics department. And then 30 years later, so it's a 30-year period, 30 years later you go back and start the cycle again. So this is the actual steps that they take to cut the trees. But this is very important. After they log, they need to inspect. And then they always have to do an assessment to make sure that what's actually done in the logging will still stay under the AAC. So like, you know, it's like a glass of, the AAC is like, you know, it's like a number of trees you can cut. And then say that they drop the trees, this is like a kind of glass of water, but if they drop the trees, you know, every year they're increasing on meeting the AAC. So this is the annual allowable cut. So every time they do this logging, they're adding more trees that are getting there. And we need this inspection and reporting. So we say, okay, in this term, for this block, we cut this many trees. So now we have this many left. That's what this inspection and assessment's job is to do. Because we want to keep under this level. However many trees we cut, we want to keep under the annual allowable cut. That's the purpose of this law, is to always keep the annual. So every year you want to keep the number of trees cut under this number. And then they need to do inspections and reporting to make sure the number of trees actually cut is always less than this number. Okay? It's a little complicated, there are different steps, but I think the basic idea is very simple. They pick a number and try to stay under. Try to stay under this number, and they do inspections and assessments to make sure. The forest department's actually picking the trees, selecting the trees, and the MTE is the one logging them. Alright, so let's look at how the MTE contracts with private companies. That will bring us back to the front, so commentary. John, let's read about that.
From 1998 and 1993, the MTE had a concession system for Thai company to log border area. This was part of their strategy to control their border area. The Thai companies built roads for the military. Thai company in particular took these contracts and severely overloaded area like Shanghai.
Okay, so in this period, this is right after when the military took over. In this early period, this is after the socialist period, and so the first thing the government wanted was foreign currency. I think, have you learned about this before? And during the socialist period, because you didn't have a market economy, the state lost so much money. It could not get tax money. So when the military took over in this period, the first thing it wanted was a lot of foreign currency, as much foreign money as it could have. And especially there were sanctions by many countries put sanctions on Burma. So it wanted ways to get foreign currency. So one way it did is to get foreign money was a concession system. They would open up for private companies to log, to take trees from these border areas. And especially they did that with these Thailand companies in this period. And it was also part of a strategy to control the border areas, because these Thai companies would build roads in the border areas for the logging, but then the Myanmar military could use those roads to try to control the border areas. So, but the problem was this. Why don't you read what the problem was?
In 1983, the MTE added the concession system to stop the deforestation. The government is not concerned China is doing the same thing.
So the problem when they had this concession system, they were shocked with the level of overlogging, because so I said in Burma you have the annual allowable cut system, but for the border areas, this is not state control. The annual allowable cut is only for state land. So they tried this experiment with borderlands, which are not under the annual allowable cut, but these private companies significantly overlogged. And from the article I read, they said there are parts of Shan State where maybe like 10 kilometers or 20 kilometers from the border, there are no trees. It's just completely bare. They just logged everything. And this was very shocking to the government how fast that they logged. They deforested. They destroyed the forest so fast that in 1993 the MTE ended the concession system because they could not trust the private companies. The private companies are not going to stay in this kind of annual allowable cut. The private companies do not care about replenishing the forest. These private companies only cared about making as much money as fast as possible. So they cut as many trees as they could and did not worry about any kind of cycle. So because the MTE could not trust these private companies, they stopped the concession system in 1993. So it's interesting now because now the government is worried that China is starting to do the same thing with like up in Kachin State and then even the northern part of Shan State, that they're starting to overforest and it's hard for the government to control. But the basic lesson is the government does not control private. The government does not trust private companies to follow this system by themselves. This is one reason why the MTE has a monopoly now, because the government wants to make sure that at least some annual cut, because the government can enforce something like this, and they would rather work with a private company than just give them a concession system outright. So that happened in 1993, they ended the concession system. So did you understand this part? Was there anything confusing about this period? This was a period when Thailand companies overforested, they overlogged. Overlogged means they cut too many trees in this period. And they cut so many trees that the government ended concessions, the concession system in 1993. So the MTE would do it by itself. Another problem was a lot of the money, the whole point was the government wanted foreign currency. The government needed money, so it wanted to use a system to make money. But for these concession systems, most of the money was going to Thailand. And the MTE also wanted to make sure most of the money came for it. So after 1993, the MTE made a monopoly so that most of the money stays inside the MTE. The MTE makes all the money for logging after 1993. But we have this part. So let's read about today's system.
However, today, MTE still contracts out some of its work to private companies. They are not technically concessions, but they work the same. Often contracts go to contracts, often
Contacts.
elite. Contracts. Mass Myanmar through trading Asia World, the gold timber.
Okay. So what's interesting to remember, after 1993, there were no more concessions. The MTE has the monopoly on cutting all the trees, but the MTE still contracts out. Have you seen this term, contract out? When you have subcontracts, it's when you're a company and you give a contract to another company to do work for you. I mean, it's everything you were learning in contract law. Most contracts are made when one company makes a contract with another company to do some work for it. So now the MTE does not have concessions. It contracts out work. It makes a contract with a private company for it to do some of the work. So these are not technically concessions. But what's interesting is they still work like concessions. So these contracts, it's not technically concession, but it ends up working like a concession. In practice, it's not much different. You have private companies that are doing logging. They're under contract with the MTE, but still private companies are doing this logging. And often the contracts will go to contacts. Contacts are like, a network, people that are connected to the military elite. So not every private company can. The difference in a concession system was any company that had money can log. But in this system, the MTE only picks private companies that it likes, that are friends with the military. So this was a list of the major companies: Max Myanmar, 2 Trading, Asia World, Dagon Timber. These are the major private companies that are doing logging in Burma now. But there's an issue with this too, so Catherine, let's read the issues with that.
Some contractors are obligated to deliver a quota to the MTE at a set price, usually much lower than market price, so they cannot make a profit. It is an incentive for illegal logging. According to one report, the high price of MTE timber allows illegal trades because the cost of permit is still less than MTE prices.
Okay, so the MTE does work with these private companies, but the MTE requires the company to sell it to the MTE for a very low price. The MTE sets the price of the wood. It sets the price very, very low, so a private company will not make any money. Even though a private company can work for the MTE will set the price of what they will pay for the wood so low that a private company cannot make a profit. So this is an incentive for illegal logging. And we have this quote, the high price of MTE timber allows illegal trade because it's the cost of a forged permit. Do you know the term forged? In contract law, did you ever learn about a forged signature? When someone else signs your name? Forged means fake. Yeah. We will talk about this a lot. So this is a kind of corruption. The government is supposed to issue a permit to log, and then so people can just buy a fake permit. Yeah, fake permit. So people can, but what the problem is, it's cheaper for a company the fake permit is very, very expensive. It's very expensive to buy this or to bribe a government official, but it's cheaper to get a forged permit or to bribe an official than to pay the MTE prices. It's much cheaper to just forge a permit, to make a fake permit, than to actually work with the MTE, to do it legally. It's very, very expensive to do it legally, and it's much cheaper to do it illegally with a fake permit or through corruption. So this is a really bad incentive. If the MTE were able to set its prices lower, then companies would rather log legally. And if companies could log legally, then the government could enforce the AAC, and everybody makes more money. Everybody makes more money when the forests are healthy and we keep the AAC. Everyone will make more money over time. But the MTE sets the prices so low, the private companies will not make money. They'd rather just forge a permit. They'd rather have a fake permit. It's cheaper for them to use a fake permit than to do it legally. That's a bad incentive. So about this part, does everyone understand how private companies can do logging in Burma today? Anything that was confusing? Can anyone summarize? So private companies do log in Burma under contracts with the MTE. But the MTE doesn't give them very much money. The MTE only gives them a little money for these contracts. So that's why there's an incentive for the private companies to do illegal logging. They can do it legally through these contracts with the MTE, but the MTE only gives them so little money that the incentive is to do it illegally.
Yeah.
Yes.
And MTE is without from government.
Yes, the MTE is the Myanmar Timber Exchange. They have
public companies.
no. monopoly on logging. It's a public company, that's right. I mean, technically it's a government office. It's a department, a government department. It's a government department, but they do contract with private companies. That was the Myanmar Timber Exchange. So the two, for all of logging regulation, for regulation there are two departments. The forestry department picks the trees, selects the trees to cut. The Myanmar Timber Exchange actually cuts the trees. These two departments work together. There are only these two departments. The forestry department picks the number, they pick the AAC, and then the forestry department selects the trees you can cut. They actually mark the trees. There will be a forest. Here's a forest. So the forestry department will actually mark the trees. So the forestry department will actually put a mark and say, you can cut this tree, you can cut this tree, but leave this tree alone. So the forestry department actually selects the trees. And the MTE, the Myanmar Timber Enterprise, actually cuts them. So the forestry department selects the trees, then the MTE cuts them. And then the forestry department says to leave this tree alone, so the MTE doesn't want to cut it. So that's how these two work together. But the MTE has contracts with private companies. It contracts with private companies.
I want to know the relationship. Now you said forestry department is mark the tree, right?
Yes, they select the trees and mark them.
Yes. MTE, Myanmar Timber Enterprise, they cut the tree.
They cut the trees.
How about private company? They also earn money.
They cut the trees.
Or they also cut the tree.
Yes, because they're under contract. The MTE contracts with them. Because the MTE, because there's so much forest, the MTE will sometimes hire a private company and say, will you cut these trees for us, for this block? Remember there were the 30 different blocks. These are different communities, like maybe there's, they're completely different areas. So sometimes maybe it's much cheaper, there's a private company there and the MTE says, I will pay you to cut these trees for us. So the MTE contracts with private companies. That's why I said it's not technically a concession. It's not a concession. It's a contract. But it works like a concession. It looks like the private company is cutting the trees for money. It works a lot like a concession. But technically the MTE has a monopoly. So the MTE is only allowed to cut the trees. But they contract with the private company to help cut them too. Not only cutting, also building the roads. The MTE does not build a road. It will hire a private company to build a road for it. The MTE may not raft the logs. They will hire a private company to help them raft the logs, float the logs in the river. So there are many private companies that work with the MTE. The problem is the MTE pays them very little. So these private companies would rather do illegal logging. They'll make much more money doing illegal logging. They cannot make a profit. Sometimes they cannot make a profit because the MTE does not pay them enough for the work. Right. Okay, so the MTE is contracting with private companies. And you can think about the difference between a concession and a contract. You learned contract law, so you know how contracts work. Okay? Does anyone else have any questions or confusions about the private companies working for the MTE? You have these major companies. but they get frustrated by the MTE setting the price setting. You know this term, price setting? It's when the government actually sets the price of the wood, how much you can sell it for. So the government, this wood is worth, you know, say this tree is worth $100, and then or 10,000 jat, and then the MTE will say, but we will only pay you 5,000 jat for this tree, even though it's worth 10,000. They set the price. So it's very inefficient. It gives people an incentive for illegal logging. If the MTE would give more money, maybe private companies would want to work with the government instead of logging illegally. Maybe some of them would rather work with the government under contracts and they could make more money. Or privatization. Another example is privatization. Private companies can work privately. But then you need to, whatever, the government just needs to make sure the AAC, annual allowable cut, is enforceable. So the government is worried about privatization because of overforesting, because of this experience. These Thai companies cut so many trees. The government is worried about this happening again. So it's worried about privatization. But maybe illegal logging may be worse. Do you see it's a kind of dilemma? Privatization can be a problem, but the MTE having a monopoly leads to illegal logging. So that's a problem too. It's like a problem one way or another. Do you see what I mean? If private companies can cut them all, they will want to overcut. But if the MTE has a monopoly, then private companies will forge a permit and have illegal logging. So that's another problem. So you have a problem either way. It's a dilemma for the government to try to fix. It's our job to try to come up with good regulations to fix this kind of problem. Okay?
Okay.
Let's look at problems with the annual allowable cut. Okay, who's someone that can read? Where were we next? Name.
Problem with the annual cut agency. More time is actually cut than the annual cut amount, mainly to assist the launching. Another thing that is AAC is that is too high.
Okay, so here's a really simple picture that you can see. The annual allowable cut. This is how many trees you can cut in a year. This is the actual number of trees that are cut in Burma every year. See, every year. So 1996 was the last time. This only goes to here, but it gets worse actually. It will go up from here. So 1996 was the last year that the actual number of trees cut was under the AAC in Burma. Every single year after that, so the purple line is the AAC, annual allowable cut. This is how many you're supposed to cut. And then the pink is actual production. This is the actual number of trees cut. So you can see, after 1997, every single year, more trees were cut than the AAC allowed. Every single year, they cut too many trees. They cut over the legal limit. And then here we see this 2004, 2005, we see this big spike. Can you remember what this big spike might be? We have this big spike of way more trees cut than the annual allowable limit. I think that goes back to another graph we saw much earlier, which was this, 2005. This was China. When we allowed China to start coming in, they cut way more than the AAC. So then we got this big spike. And then here is when they started cracking down on China. They started trying to stop China from cutting so much. So this is China in 2005, and then each year the government's trying to reduce it from cutting so much. So that's why we have this big spike of more trees cut than they were legally allowed to cut. So this is the problem. This is one problem. More trees are actually cut than the AAC allows. So one thing we want to understand is, why are more trees being cut than the law allows. This is what the law says you must cut, and this is the actual number of trees. Why are more trees being cut than the law allows? That's one question. And then another problem we have is the AAC itself is too high. So later we will learn, we'll look at, this is, the AAC should actually be around here. This is what's the most sustainable, the best for the forest is here. This is so that even the actual AAC is too high. And then people are actually cutting more than what the law allows. But let's look at first why. Why are more trees being cut than is legally allowed? First of all, do you understand what this picture is? Is there anything confusing about this? This is what the law said. This is the law. This is the actual number of trees cut. So that's not confusing, is it? You got it. Okay, so why are we cutting more trees than the law allows? Let's read about that.
Problems with the station system, MSS, and natural low-level cut ACC. So, since 1970, tick productions has, according to the official figures, exceeded the AAC by the least an average of 15%. In FAO report said the MTE literally exceed what it should cut, and there is no balance between timber productions and the forest is.
Okay, so first let's make sure you know these words. Since 1970 for the teak production, according to the official figures, so Burma's own statistics. Do you know this term to exceed? To exceed is to go over, to go above, to go over. Exceeded the AAC by an average of 15%. So since 1970, the number of teak trees actually cut is on average 15% more than the AAC every year. And then we have this Forest and Agriculture Organization report saying the MTE largely exceeds, goes over what it should cut, and there's no balance between the timber production, the number of trees cut, and the forest base. Forest base is the number of trees you need to remain to have a healthy forest. So there's no balance between the number of trees actually cut and a forest base. A forest is like a living creature. If you kill too much of it, the entire forest will die. Do you understand what I mean? If you leave a forest base, if you leave enough healthy trees, the forest will heal itself. But if you cut too many healthy trees, the forest is like an animal or something. It will die when you cut too many. You need to keep the forest base. So this report's saying there's no balance between the number of trees cut and the forest base, the base of healthy trees to let the forest heal itself. So let's read about why that is. Mudipa, let's read these.
Early AAC were made for the inter-country, but because of conflict, only coastal areas were cut, making them overcut. However, the AAC level have not decayed much. In the 1980s, at the end of the socialist era, at with economics session, the government went to a lot of foreigner currency. Exporting loans were a success. This was an incentive to preserve the foreign
department. This is short for department.
Department to set a very high AAC.
Go ahead and read this last one.
The last certificate AAC was set in the 1960s. Since then, the AAC has been set to what will maximize profits for the MTE, not what the most sustainable for the forest.
Okay, very good. Those were tough words. That was very good. So now we're looking. I don't know how much I'll be able to explain before class is over. So we'll have to continue the next class, but Now we're trying to explain why are more trees cut than the law allows. And why is the AAC being set too high generally? So the first AACs were, okay, this is a map of your country, isn't it? So the first ones, they made an AAC for the entire country. But because of the conflict, not the entire country was forested. Only a smaller part of the forest was actually cut. So then the AAC was supposed to be a big number for the entire country. But when you take this big number and you cut it for only a smaller part, then you can see you're going to overcut. You're going to cut too much. Do you see how that works? You're picking the AAC for the entire country, but you're cutting a smaller part of it. But you're using the same number. If you use the same number, you're going to cut too many trees inside the smaller part. This is going to get overcut. So this is one problem. The only controlled areas were cut. And then the second issue we mentioned before, the government wanted foreign currency. At the end of the socialist period and economic sanctions, the government wanted foreign currency. You understand about foreign currency?
Yes.
They wanted, because the value of the kyat was dropping, so they wanted foreign currency. They wanted American dollars and Chinese, what is it? Yuan. Right, yuan. They wanted this foreign currency as a base to hold the value, economic value, because the foreign currency does not fluctuate in value. It's very stable. So the government really likes to have foreign currency. And in the 1980s, they didn't have any. So exporting logs was a source. But it was an incentive to pressure the foreign department to set a very high AAC. They wanted a lot of this foreign currency, so they pressured the foreign department, the forestry department. They pressured the forestry department to set a high, very high AAC. They said, we want you to set a very high AAC because we want to cut more trees. Because we want to make this foreign currency. We don't care about protecting the forest, we care about making foreign currency. So set a very high AAC for this year. The forestry department was under a lot of pressure. Well, this is the end of our class, so let's go ahead and, yeah, we should finish there so we can continue for the next class. Thank you, everybody.